Good afternoon and welcome to the Middle East Forum of Falmouth. My name is Mark Schulman. I'm the president of MEF, as we call it. Today's webinar features Dr. Sanam Vakil, who will be talking about politics and protest in the Islamic Republic of Iran. I'm going to come back at the end with a few announcements and other information, but we're going to get right to it. So I'm now going to pass the program to my colleague, Kathy Plazak, who will introduce today's speaker and explain how to do the Q&A session. Over to you, Kathy.
Thank you, Mark. So I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Vakil, who is the director of the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House in London, where her research focuses on regional security, Gulf geopolitics, and on the future trends in Iran's domestic and foreign policy. She's also a lecturer in the Middle East Studies Department at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in Bologna, Italy. Previously, she served as a research associate at the Council on Foreign Relations and has provided research analysis to the World Bank's Middle East and North Africa Department. She is the author of Action and Reaction, Women and Politics in Iran, and she regularly publishes analysis and comments for a variety of media and academic outlets. She received her PhD from Johns Hopkins University, was born in Tehran, and is a recognized authority on the women's movement in Iran, on the historical and geographic underpinnings of Iranian worldview, and brings us important insights into the Iranian government and popular sentiments there. So we're very fortunate to have her here today. Before I turn it over to Dr. Vakil, I just want to remind everyone that we will welcome questions at the end of her talk. So please, at any time, submit your questions by using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, not the chat, but the Q&A functions. And we will turn to those questions at the end of the talk. So with that, I'm very pleased to introduce and turn over the microphone to Dr. Vakil.
Thank you so much, Kathy, and thank you to you and Mark for having me with you today. I understand overcame a good degree of scrutiny, and so I feel honored to be part of this group. I'm going to just share my screen so I can bring up a couple of slides that I thought I would share with you today. And just bear with me as I play it from the start. Thought what I would do would be to give you a bit of background about Iran and the Islamic Republic, and then sort of talk about politics in Iran. You all might remember that in September of last year, a young Kurdish girl named Mahsa Jina Amini was killed by the Iranian morality police for not adhering to the legal requirements of women's dress in Iran. And her death sparked a series of protests throughout the country that lasted from September more or less into early 2023. The protests were striking to much of the international community and also the media, and also to the Iranian diaspora, as well as, of course, to Iranians inside Iran. These were not the sort of first rounds of protests we've seen in the Islamic Republic's history. And just to remind you, the Islamic Republic was born in 1979, so it's a very middle-aged state. I thought that I would try to put these protests in context. Many people thought, including many members of my own family, that these protests were going to be the big one, the one that brought down the Islamic Republic. Sadly, I was like many of my colleagues that look at Iran and look at Middle Eastern politics, could have pretty much told you on September 30th that the protests would eventually be quashed by the Islamic Republic. So I'm not trying to say I knew it all or that I'm a sort of I told you so, but this is a state and this is a system It's not a government being held up by one individual. So understanding how the state manages politics and manages the 85 million people that live inside the Islamic Republic, I think is important to understand the resilience of the Islamic Republic. And it's an interesting case study, I think, also in the context of maybe thinking about some of the developments that we saw over the past 48 hours in Russia, and thinking about authoritarianism in general. I think that in the United States, there is a prevailing view that democracy also always wins. And over the past decade, we have seen the power of strong men grow, and we've seen the ability of individuals to manipulate institutions and to create more resilient authoritarian structures. And so I think the Islamic Republic is one of these model states that has proven to be resilient. Doesn't mean it doesn't have challenges, doesn't have protests, but understanding that resilience and the tools that it uses to be resilient, I think is important to be predictive as to how that state might evolve. Just a little early sort of happy slide I like to always show. This is the beautiful Middle East that unfortunately doesn't get too much attention for its beauty. It's always being portrayed in the media as a conflict-ridden place with lots of wars and lots of challenges. Doesn't mean those challenges aren't there, but you can sort of see by the pockets of light, the areas of population density around the region. And Iran is situated between the two waterways, the Persian Gulf and the Caspian Sea, and you can sort of see the dense parts of Iran being Tehran, Esfahan in the center, and then in the south, and then of course you can also look at Saudi Arabia, for example, and see how its population is also gathered in particular areas. This is a map of Iran, and I think looking at the geography of countries is really important to help us understand their worldview and their sort of security mindset. Iran is surrounded by many states, and it's a country that has a very long history going back thousands of years. In terms of ethnicity, of course, I'm going to show you some slides about the diverse ethnic groups, but Iran is primarily Persian in ethnicity, and this has set it apart from its Arab neighbors. And also to the east, of course, it has Central Asian states, Afghanistan, Pakistan. It's been blessed by its proximity to the Caspian Sea and the Persian Gulf, and that water access, and that has been a positive part of its geography. But this map, I think, shows you also that it has had security challenges with Afghanistan. It suffered through an 8-year war with Iraq from 1980 to 1988. Effectively, this is a difficult neighborhood, and Iran, and particularly the Islamic Republic, hasn't built very strong bridges in its neighborhood, and has seen itself isolated, I think, perhaps by its own doing and by the worldview of the leadership in Iran. But this notion of strategic loneliness and isolation is one that I think we should try to understand when thinking about the decision making and thinking about sort of how leaders in Iran see themselves and see themselves a bit under siege. This is a map that shows Iran's ethnic diversity. Of course, you can also see that of Turkey and other Arab countries. But the ethnic diversity, of course, is interesting. Sorry, my dog is going a bit crazy. The ethnic diversity is a bit interesting because you can see that Iran historically has been at the crossroads of many different cultures and civilizations. And with its geography, there's been a lot of mixing of people inside the Islamic Republic. So there's a huge variety of ethnic groups as well as religious groups. And this religious and ethnic heterogeneity is an interesting, again, in the Middle East, because if you look at let's say Iraq or Syria or Saudi Arabia, you can just really see that there is more homogeneity in terms of ethnicity, whereas obviously there are challenges when there are a mixing of groups and people and identity. So I think that's important to understand as well. This slide will sort of give you a bit more of a religious view inside Iran as well. Iran is a majority Shia Muslim country, and this, of course, sets Iran apart from most of the rest of the Middle East, where most of the region in terms of religious identity and religious affiliation sees itself as Sunni compared to the Shia. But Iran also has more religious diversity. It has a smaller Sunni population. It has a Christian population. It continues to be one of the few Middle Eastern countries that has a Jewish community as well. And so, that diversity is also interesting and important. The Islamic Republic that came into being in 1979 created a political system that draws inspiration and draws its interpretation from Shia Islam. And so this is quite unique that you have religious authority at the helm, and that this religious authority has used and relied on religious ideology in order to keep the state together, despite all of this pluralism and despite the ethnic and religious diversity in the country. I also wanted to just show you this graph, which I think is important as well, as I sort of build to the politics and the protest narrative. There is a general statistic that is thrown out there to describe Middle Eastern populations, which are generally believed to be quite young. Most of the Middle East has around a population of 60 to 70% under the age of 30 years old. And that those sort of demographic shifts have, of course, been behind the Arab Spring protests of 2011, when states haven't been able to provide jobs or economic security for their populations. Of course, grievances build and mount, and protests definitely develop. The Islamic Republic of Iran experienced its population boom much earlier than the rest of the Middle East. In the first decade, from 1980 to 1988, the population doubled. And so Iran's population today is 86 million. But by the early 1990s, already this new state was facing a massive baby boom that was encouraged by the government, mind you. Why is this important, and why am I talking to you about this today? Well, the Islamic Republic's average population is no longer under the age of 30. The average age in the Islamic Republic, as you will see here, is higher. They're sort of between the ages of 35 and 45 are where you have the average age in Iran. Why does this matter? Well, I can attest that as you age, as I'm sure all of you will know as well, your choices and your preferences change. And perhaps you're no longer keen on protesting or taking to the streets and taking risks the same way you would when you were 20 years old. This matters when we think about the politics of protests in Iran, and particularly this last round of protests that we experienced. Because these last rounds of protests were led by what many scholars call Iran's Gen Z. So they are under the age of 20 or under the age of 25. And so they are a very small portion of the Iranian population today, with the average age of Iranians being sort of my age, from 45 40, I'm a bit older than that now. I'm older than the Islamic Republic, but and most of the people I know inside Iran were not protesting, were not on the streets because they were quite worried about their jobs and their families and their security. And so I think this demographic shift is important to keep track of when we're waiting for revolution inside a country, and then not understanding why people are not protesting. And I'm going to come back to this point, but I just wanted to just show you this because it comes up quite a bit. This is just another view of Iran, and I wanted to show you how close Iran is to the countries on the other side of the Persian Gulf. It's, you know, just a 45-minute boat ride from the northern tip of the United Arab Emirates to the southern part of Iran, where the Straits of Hormuz are. These are the one of the most the important choke points for maritime shipping in the world, and Iran sits aboard one of them. And of course, a lot of oil traffic and tankers cross through the Straits of Hormuz. So this gives the Islamic Republic a bit of leverage in perhaps influencing oil prices or threatening its neighbors. And it does plenty of that. But also just looking at the size of Iran relative to a little Kuwait or a Qatar or even a Bahrain, I think is important. Many of my work trips take me to the GCC states, and in discussions that I have with analysts or policymakers, you know, they say every day we wake up and we look up and there's that big Islamic Republic. And so they are faced with the geography and demography of Iran. It's a country of 85 million people. You know, that poses huge security challenges and huge security concerns for these states as well. And you will all maybe have remembered that Iran regularly threatens to close down the Straits of Hormuz. It has never closed them down, of course, because if it shuts off the Straits of Hormuz, will also shut itself off access to trade and shipping. But it does give Iran an important sort of vantage point here. I also, again, want to talk to you a bit more about sort of politics inside Iran. And before we look at this slide, I thought I would give you a little graphic of the elderly men that have been the founding fathers of the Iranian political establishment. The man without the glasses is Ayatollah Khomeini. He was sort of the revolutionary figurehead and founding father of the political system that was created in 1979. Khomeini is a religious figure of that was quite respected and became the sort of moral, symbolic head of the Iranian opposition that began to build against the monarchy from the 1960s. And so Khomeini developed moral as well as religious and eventually political authority to bring together all of the different factions and sort of opposition groups that were in support of the revolution. Khomeini ruled Iran as supreme leader from 1979 until his death in 1989. And he was succeeded by the man on my right with glasses. His name is Ali Khamenei. And Khamenei has been in power since 1989. He is one of the longest ruling leaders in the Middle East, I think, if not the longest right now. He's about 84 years old. And there is not a huge degree of clarity as to what comes next after Khamenei passes away. This isn't a system where he has felt comfortable designating a successor. And so there is a lot of anticipation and uncertainty as to what comes next. And this very much matters because political transition in general in any political system is really important. But in the Islamic Republic, it has not just going to be impactful for Iran's 85 million population, but also for the wider Middle East, because Iran is known to be a destabilizing political state. It has supported proxy groups beyond its borders. It has interfered in politics in Iraq. It supports Hezbollah. It has a nuclear program. It has a ballistic missile program. It's sending drones to Russia. So what happens inside Iran actually has broader international as well as regional consequences. So the question mark of succession is something that Iran watchers, as well as, of course, many international governments are watching, trying to anticipate, so that they can be sort of ready for what comes next. But it is the unpredictable, or the most important unknown known that we're trying to stay ahead of. And I think it's important to understand Iran's political system. It is a Islamic Republic. And it is a hybrid system, and it's quite unique. It's a system that relies on Islamic ideology as a guiding principle, and the supreme leader is supposedly ruling Iran, or at the helm of the Iranian state, until the 12th Imam returns. So he's got this sort of religious dimension to his leadership. But he manages this very complex system, as you will see from this graphic below. And this system is effectively divided between institutions that are unelected under the supreme leader's control, and elected institutions. And that's the Republican part of the state. And the Republican part of the state relies on people to vote in elections that are held every 4 years for president, for parliament, as well as for this body up here called the Assembly of Experts. And the Assembly of Experts is the body that is supposedly going to pick the next supreme leader. So it's kind of this hybrid system, but the electoral part of the state is important and has been used by the Iranian political establishment as a means of involving people in the political process, and to show their legitimacy. And so this is like a feature of the authoritarian system that uses the legal rational system, as Max Weber would argue, as a source of authoritarian legitimacy. But ultimately, the president and the parliament do not have any independent authority. Most of their power is checked by the supreme leader or by institutions that operate in the informal, unelected part of the political system. No law can pass parliament without the approval of, for example, this body known as the Guardian Council. Iranian foreign policy decisions are not made independently by the Iranian president. They're made in another body just above the president called the Supreme National Security Council, labeled here as SNNC. So it's quite a convoluted system that actually also has a number of important players involved. Even though there is this one guy, Ali Khamenei, who sits at the top, all of these different institutions have key political players and figures involved. And so I think another facet and feature of Iran that is often misunderstood is this is a bureaucratized system. This is not a system that is managed by one individual who dictates. Actually, this is a system that relies on circulation of the elites, and that has brought in more individuals since 1979 into the political system and made them beneficiaries of this system. So there is much more of a process and the institutions in Iran after the revolution also were not destroyed. They were just expanded upon. So the bureaucracy is quite strong, and like most bureaucracies, quite slow and sometimes it doesn't function very well, but it continues to function. Importantly, one of the supreme leader's most important relationships that it has is he has a very strong relationship with the military establishment in Iran. Like most authoritarian leaders, there's not just one military, there's two. This is, of course, coup-proofing strategy that exists in authoritarian states. And so he has an army that is separate from the IRGC that you've certainly heard about. They've been designated in the United States and Canada as a terrorist organization. And they are constitutionally mandated inside Iran to protect the security and stability of the Islamic Republic. They have grown in size and influence since 1979. They were instrumental in helping Iran survive and push back against the Iran-Iraq War from 1980 to 1988. And like most paramilitary and military organizations, they became involved in the economy after the war. And following that, they have become more politically active. What is often misunderstood about them is that many people assume they're independent, like they're going to go off and become like a Wagner group. And that's not the case at all. Their power and authority is very much beholden to that of the supreme leaders. And the supreme leader regularly circulates the generals. Nobody stays in a position for too long. He moves them around and moves them on. But the relationship is very hierarchical, and there's a lot of loyalty between the two. So I think that's important to understand. But this system, in addition to being, unwieldy and oftentimes confusing, is also very factionalized. And Iran's political elite is not united. Obviously, there is the ideology of the Islamic Republic and the belief that Islam should underpin all of their legal and political decision making. But in reality, of course, there are divisions within the political establishment in terms of policy. Most of Iran's elite are united in wanting to preserve the Islamic Republic, but they're divided on how to preserve the Islamic Republic. And that's why Iran's elections have produced different candidates and different presidents over the years. Mind you, the great irony is that once there is one consistency, regardless of your political affiliation inside Iran, once you become president, all of Iran's presidents under Ali Khamenei have fallen out with him, and they are basically, they leave office with very bad relationships. And that's because the president basically doesn't have adequate independent authority to enact policy. And so it leads to a tussle and a struggle for power within the political system. And this has not been reconciled as long as Khamenei has been supreme leader. But this slide will show you the sort of the spectrum within Iran. And the spectrum matters because obviously people, young people, but also the Iranian middle class have in general continuously voted for Iranian reformists through the years. And the support for reformists is really driven by the fact that younger and more liberal urban-based Iranians are looking for greater Iranian economic and social integration with the international community. And reformists have long thought that the best way to save the Islamic Republic is to make it thrive. And the best way to do that is to reintegrate Iran into the international economic community. And that's why the Islamic Republic, under its pragmatist reformist president, Hassan Rouhani, signed the JCPOA, Iran's nuclear agreement with the West, because there was a hope that with sanctions relief, Iran would be able to economically grow and engage more with the international community. And so thereby it would address some of its security challenges. But conservatives on the other side of the spectrum, and I'm just being quite simplistic, conservatives see the system as perpetually under threat by the West, and not just the West, but specifically the United States. They are very paranoid that the United States is looking to overthrow regime change inside Iran, and that was has been at different times under different U.S. presidents part of their Iran policy. And so conservatives are looking actually to limit Western engagement and looking to preserve the Islamic Republic by self-reliance and through resisting Western pressure. So you have these sort of two poles and these two tensions within the political establishment. And that makes politics quite contentious inside Iran. And in fact, in the context of this opacity and uncertainty over succession, and in the context of continued tensions with the United States, you might remember that President Donald Trump withdrew from the Iran nuclear agreement in May 2018. Since then, Iran has been under maximum pressure sanctions. Most of Iran's economy is sanctioned. It's oil sales, gas sales, and has very limited access to the international financial system. This tension with the West, if not with the United States, is very much embedded in this moment where we don't know what's going to happen domestically in terms of succession. But of course, this is putting immense amount of pressure on ordinary Iranians and the system from below. So it takes us, I think, straight to the protests. I gave you a bit of background already. We saw protests for about a 6-month period. And I just wanted to pull up this slide to show you some of the protests in Iran's history. Most of them are historical, but I think if you look from about 1999, and this unfortunately stops at 2018, you will see that there are quite a number of important protests that Iran experienced. In 1999, it had massive student protests in Tehran and in the other big cities. And that was sort of the first wake-up call and pressure that came from Iran's young population that was demanding reform from within. The big bang was in 2009 under the Green Movement protests, when spontaneously, in reaction to what many people thought was fraudulent election results, there was the Green Movement protests. And in the Green Movement protests, actually, that was a real serious challenge to the regime, because 3 million people were out one day in Tehran. The government effectively, over a 9-month period, began to quash and repress the protests. But those protests were quite brutal. They rounded up much of many of the protesters, lots of students, arrested many politicians that were involved, and including former presidential candidates remain under house arrest even today. And so the Green Movement protests were real political shockwaves for the Islamic Republic. In 2017 and again in 2019, we had another 2 series of massive protests. Those were economically driven, probably a result of economic frustration as a result of high inflation, chronic economic mismanagement within the system. And those protests spread very rapidly around the country. And so those protests were in over 80 cities and were quite powerful. And through all of these protests, what the state has done is develop sort of a crackdown playbook, as let's say cynics like myself call it. They begin to implement a similar strategy first they roll off the internet, then they allow people to protest for a little bit. Protests are useful. You get to see who hates you, who your protesters are, and you allow people, of course, to air their grievances. As long, you want to give off the impression that you can handle the protests as well. When the protests don't die down, that's when, of course, the violence begins, and people are first warned, then they're invited to come in for questioning, then they're arrested, of course, and then there's more brutal crackdowns that take place. And in the last 3 protests, there have been executions also as a result of the violence that has taken fold. And I would just say that the protests of last fall were, very striking, and I think grabbed a lot of international attention for a variety of reasons. There were different communities in Iran protesting. You had Kurdish groups protesting in the north because Mahsa Amini was Kurdish, and she was from a very important Kurdish family. You also had Baluchi protests in the southeast of Iran. And they're, of different ethnicity, and they come from a very poor part of Iran, and they sort of seized on the protest movement as well. And then you had young Gen Zers that were also protesting against her death, against, let's say, the lack of dignity inside the country, the economic frustration, and this was very much billed internationally as also being hijab protests or women's protests. I'm not sure it was just a women's protest. I felt a bit uncomfortable with that label. I felt that the protests were much more representative of grievances felt by many Iranians. But the limitation of these protests was that they didn't mobilize huge segments of society onto the streets. In fact, there were at maximum a couple thousand people gathered here and there. And so, the protests also didn't develop into a sort of cohesive movement. There was no real leadership, there was no clear organization, and there were no demands. There was a lot of chanting and in some cases a bit of rioting, in some cases some peaceful demonstrations, acts of civil disobedience, but there was never a sort of clear sense of the direction of the protests. It was a lot of anger that manifested, and unfortunately, for people who work or study revolutions, you need to create some of these missing links in order for a social movement or for civil disobedience to result in some kind of political change. And effectively, in the Islamic Republic, not immediately, but progressively, they cracked down harder and harder on these protests. And I think the sort of high point was when they began to execute some of the young protesters. They executed four young men, and of course, over 500 people were killed in the protests, all to slowly, progressively shut them down and sort of reassert control over the political system. Most of us that watch Iran don't think that the protests are over, because there is a history of protests in Iran, and because the Islamic Republic hasn't ever really addressed popular grievances, social, political, and economic, there is an expectation and anticipation that there will be another spontaneous trigger, and there will be further protests. We've seen pensioners protest, teachers protest, farmers have protested also over this past year. And some academics even count the protests and say that there are an average of 400 protests in Iran today. Not trying to diminish what happened last fall, but protest is part of the political environment and will continue to be until this system evolves, or there is a political transition where the state tries to address the popular grievances that exist throughout Iran's society. Just before I wrap up, I thought I would say a word or two about Iran's foreign policy, which attracts a lot of attention and sanctions because the Islamic Republic, as a country that's seen itself strategically lonely and isolated, has developed relationships and influence in the Middle East by supporting groups, proxy groups, and hybrid actors beyond its borders. It has helped grow and develop Hezbollah. It's supported Bashar al-Assad during the Syrian civil war. It's created militias and supported them since the 2003 Iraq war. It supported the Houthis in Yemen. It supports some Palestinian groups around the region. Not all of these groups are Shia. And in fact, it sort of speaks to another oftentimes misrepresented fact about the Islamic Republic. Despite the fact that it's a Shia state, it is much more of a pragmatic state. It's a state that is looking to survive and build security and stability inside Iran. And so these relationships are not sectarian relationships. They're much more directed to unifying Iran with other groups that share its worldview. And the worldview is anti-Western, it's anti-American. The objective is to reduce US influence in the Middle East and to build what they call an axis of resistance, to resist the West, and of course, to push back against the US's proxy in the region, and that's Israel. So you will see all of the arrows are pointing to Israel and see Israel as an extension of the United States in the region. And just, lastly, just to show you what the worldview from Tehran used to look like during the Iraq War. This was the stars represented all of the areas where the US had military bases in the region. And so the Islamic Republic very much saw itself as surrounded. And so part of this proxy-based strategy has been to push back and to develop influence to also harass, if not more, to American troops in the region. And ultimately, the state of the Islamic Republic is looking to reduce the US influence, and it sees itself and it sees its strategy as a patient one that isn't in a hurry, isn't dependent on electoral cycles, one that over decade after decade of investment has developed relationships that are very long-standing, and it sees, of course, U.S. shifts in politics and U.S. sort of isolationism as a success and a sort of victory for the Islamic Republic. So as the U.S. is prioritizing geopolitical tensions, as the U.S. is prioritizing the war in Ukraine, there's less U.S. engagement in the Middle East. The Biden administration didn't even mention the Middle East in the last State of the Union, and that was sort of a novel shift that we've observed over a number of US presidencies, but now it's really front and center. These are sort of positive outcomes for the Islamic Republic because it sees itself as being able to resist, and it is resilient. It's not afraid to destabilize other countries, and it's not afraid to also repress its own citizens, all to stay there and to stay there in spite of this what it sees as a long-term Western effort at containing, if not trying to change the Islamic Republic. So this is a bit of the tension, and this is a bit of the challenge for the international community, particularly with the war in Ukraine and the distraction, how to also address human rights issues, domestic challenges in Iran, but also, contend with Iran's menacing behavior in the region, as well as its advancing nuclear weapons program. So I'm going to stop there and hopefully take a bit of time to answer some questions. I think a few of them have come in, and thank you for listening.
Dr. Vakil, thank you so much. There are a number of questions that have come in, and we will get to as many of them as we can. We had one participant who, in the context that you painted of Iran and its neighbors, one participant asked about the enmity and proxy wars between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And this person writes that now I read that China has intervened and that the Saudis and Iranians have exchanged diplomats. What was the basis or cause of this original enmity, and what did China do to improve this relationship?
Thank you for that. That's an important question. And that could be almost a conversation of its own. So Saudi Arabia and Iran have had, both were close allies of the United States prior to 1979. There's always a bit of competition because Iran always saw itself as a sort of big brother monarchy. But in 2016, and of course, since 1979, the revolution and the ideology was very threatening to the rest of the Middle East, and the fact that a monarch was overthrown was also very threatening to Middle Eastern monarchs. So that it already created a lot of hostility and lack of trust. But in 2016, in Iran, the Saudi embassy was attacked in response to the Saudis killing a Shia cleric in Saudi Arabia. And this speaks to obviously sectarian tensions between the two states, but it really speaks to more of the competition between the two countries and the history of interference between both countries in trying to destabilize the other. They have a lot more in common. They're both authoritarian and resilient states, mind you, that are human rights abusers and don't maybe treat their citizens as well as they should. But there is this enmity of competition. And so Saudi Arabia withdrew its ambassadors in 2016 and through the Trump administration joined the US in supporting maximum pressure. And they were very upset about the Iran nuclear agreement. They saw that as whitewashing Iran's proxy relationships around the region, and it's destabilizing regional behavior. Long story short, the relationship with Trump out of office and with the US not really having made serious military effort to protect their Gulf partners from Iran's bullying behavior. This is what sort of led to the Saudi government shifting course and recognizing that not talking to Iran was perhaps getting in the way of Saudi Arabia's national interests. This is, again, I could just go on for a long time. Saudi Arabia has Mohammed bin Salman. He's promoting Vision 2030. He needs regional stability. He needs to attract FDI. He needs to get over the reputational damage of the Jamal Khashoggi killing. There's been a war in Yemen ongoing. Iran has been supporting the Houthis. So it's all quite interconnected. And in 2019, Iran attacked Saudi oil facilities with drones and cruise missiles. And this was sort of a wake-up call that Iran was actually militarily much more sophisticated and advanced than everyone imagined. So effectively, once Biden came into office, the Saudis, not getting off on the right foot with the Biden administration, decided to pursue back-channel talks with Tehran. And over 18 months, they began to define the contours over the agreement, but they never finalized the agreement. And the time was just right. Iran was looking to improve its or reduce some of its threats after the protests. And it was believed that the Saudis were supporting Iranian groups in the diaspora. Again, very complicated, but Iran saw an opportunity to de-escalate with Saudi Arabia. The Saudis thought it was an opportunity, and they went to the Chinese to broker the deal and push the deal over the line to embarrass the United States. So it's a very long-winded answer that shows you and picks up on some of the tensions and themes that are domestic, that are regional, but also international.
Thank you. So And we will actually, as an aside, have a presentation later in the season on China's influence and activities in the Middle East, which is a fascinating topic. So another question, and I think this came up when you showed the slide on the political factions, the reformists, the pragmatic conservatives, et cetera. And we had a participant who asked about the percentages of each of these political factions, which are larger and smaller. And related to that, also a question about, the same person asked about the education level, since Iran is a fairly well-educated society, and women in particular making up a large percentage of university students. So how do those factions play out?
Sure. We don't have, unfortunately, statistics on factional affiliation. And most authoritarian states don't share too much data because they see all of this data as a security risk. So I wouldn't be able to, I wouldn't be able to tell you exactly. But in terms of sort of composition and background, I would say that urban-based, middle-class, educated minorities, and women and students tend to be reformists. And conservatives, I think, would be a smaller minority of the population. And why would I say that? Just looking at some of the electoral outcomes, when Iranians go and vote, and in general, they have had high participation rates in elections, the turnout of the vote tends to favor reformists. But when Iran doesn't vote, when the people don't come out to vote, which took place in 2021, the election goes to conservatives. And that's how the current president, Ebrahim Raisi, won, with the lowest turnout ever in the history of the Islamic Republic. I think he won with like 48% of the vote. So that's really all I can tell you. I wouldn't underestimate the influence and the sort of power of conservatives. Iran, despite, it's a cleavage country like most, but you do have, most people are religious, most people have some sort of connection to the government, but I would say that the conservatives have about 30% of the support of the population. And Iran, you're right, is highly educated. That has been one of the outcomes of the Islamic Republic. Interestingly, because women were veiled, many traditional families felt comfortable sending their girls to segregated or mixed schools, but because the girls were, their heads were covered. So it's resulted in high educational attainment, also at the university level. The problem is, of course, that there hasn't been a translation in terms of jobs for young people, and also particularly for women. Iran has one of the lowest female labor force participation rates in the Middle East. And that's because it is still a patriarchal society, and where unemployment is officially about 10%, I would say unofficially it's about 30%. Obviously, men are still seen to be primary breadwinners. Legally, they are as well. And so jobs tend to go more towards men. But there is, I think, just to pick up on the women's issues, a very fierce and sort of strong female culture in Iran. When you do have women at the table, they're not sort of quiet women. They're not just there as a sort of key performance indicator. They are quite empowered, and there is sort of an activist and sort of protest tradition inside Iran, active, sort of in all sectors of society as well.
Yeah, thank you. So there's a question about the pandemic, how Iran handled the recent pandemic, how did they perform? And were the protests in any way tied to the pandemic and how the government performed during it?
So the pandemic was, I think there hasn't been enough sort of study about the impact of the pandemic. We don't know about deaths, but we will as soon as they conduct a census. We'll have a good understanding of how many people actually died in Iran. The problem is that Iran has been under sanctions, and because of its hostility with the United States, it refused to formally accept Western vaccines. So it did for a period of time take the China vaccine, the Sinopharm vaccine, and then eventually it did start to buy some of the Western vaccines, but couldn't really do so publicly because you're not supposed to really be benefiting from the West. You know, everything should be indigenous and everything should be, it became quite political. You know, Iran, interestingly, despite sanctions and despite sort of the hostility and tensions with its neighbors, much of the pandemic began, I think, to spread from Iran because Iran does have close ties to China. And it was quite interesting that I think that businessmen or even pilgrims that were coming from Iran took a lot of the COVID back to their own countries. And so despite the sort of marginalization and lack of political ties, I think the religious ties as well as the economic ties showed that there, you know, Iran was a bit of a hub for it. And the state, you know, didn't have the capacity to manage it effectively, couldn't afford to lock people in because of the economic challenges that it faced. I don't think the protests were driven by that. I think the protests are basically, you know, Iran is a pressure cooker, and you know, at different times, motivated by, you know, very small sparks, people can just take to the streets and express their frustrations. So, you know, it's not just about what women are wearing. I think it's really much more about the daily frustrations, the impact of sanctions, how the currency has devalued 4 times. I was speaking to a professor the other night who told me, you know, my salary used to be $3,000 a month. Now it's $400 a month. Mm-hmm. You know, how people are making ends meet is something, you know, it's very hard to imagine.
Yeah. This may require a short answer. Is it safe for Americans to travel to Iran?
No, I would say strongly not. Iran, one of another aspect of its bad behavior is that it detains dual nationals as well as nationals of other countries and uses them to extract concessions from the West. So currently, the Biden administration is potentially considering getting 4 U.S. dual nationals out of Iran in exchange for access to Iran's frozen foreign reserves. So definitely don't go.
Yeah. So whoever asked that question, don't make your reservations yet. Are there any potential repercussions for the Iranian regime's decision to assist Russia's attack on Ukraine?
That's a very good question. It depends if you think that if sanctions are effective. Obviously, the West, the international community, has strongly condemned and sanctioned Iran for that behavior. I don't think that anyone can really do anything. Sanctions have become an end rather than a means, and they've not really moved the dial in changing Iran's behavior. The question is, why is Iran choosing to support Russia in this war? And I think it's a reflection of the years of lack of trust, the failure to rehabilitate the JCPOA, the understanding perhaps among conservatives in Iran that the West, the US, Europe, isn't going to be able to economically engage with the Islamic Republic. So it is looking for alternative relationships that could lead to economic opportunities and strategic opportunities. And in fact, this is where Iran's geography is proving to be really useful. The Russians and the Iranians have activated a north-south transport corridor. And so Russia is moving its oil through Iran. It is then blended with Iranian oil and then blended perhaps with Emirati oil and then sold on the international market. So there's a lot of trade that is moving through Iran right now. And this relationship, while maybe, you know, not ideal and Putin isn't really loved in Iran, is providing Tehran with a bit of an economic lifeline, and I think perhaps also a strategic one.
Yeah. So we have time for maybe just one more question, and just related to that, should sanctions be part of the United States' policy towards Iran? Are sanctions at all effective, or can they be effective in changing Iran's behavior and policies?
I don't think that they are effective. The Islamic Republic has been sanctioned for 44 years, and I don't see very much change in Iran's behavior. The JCPOA was the one anomaly, and there are debates as to whether it was sanctions pressure or if actually Iran came back to the negotiating table because of a change in the Obama administration's policy on enrichment. I think that probably the international community needs to coordinate and re-exert some deterrence against the Islamic Republic, and that's been a bit absent.
Yeah, okay. Wonderful. Well, we are unfortunately out of time. For those of you, there is several more questions that we're just not able to get to. But we want to thank Dr. Vakil for joining us today. We learned a lot. Thank you so much for sharing your invaluable perspective and being with us this afternoon. And at this point, I will turn the program back to Mark Schulman for a couple of concluding comments.
Okay, thank you. And let me add, Sanam, that was a fabulous talk. A tour of the domestic challenges that Iran faces and where those challenges come from. I think rather than call it a tour, I should call it a tour de force. That was great. I do have a couple of announcements. Well, one thing I want to emphasize, this program that MEF puts on is a collaborative effort. We're a committee of 9 people. You've met 2 of us today, but the full committee is described on our website, which is www.mef.world. And I hope you'll have a look at us. There's something of the history of this program there also. And there's a donation page. I want to emphasize that this program is fully dependent and successfully fully dependent on the contributions that come from our viewers. And I should add, the committee members. Okay. The next lecture, July 9th, Asli Aydin Tashbash will talk about Turkey in a world of great power competition. I hope you'll join us. It's going to be an opportunity you'll come out of this lecture understanding Turkey. So in wrapping up, I want to again thank our speaker, Dr. Sanam Vakil. I want to thank Kathy for doing a great job with the intro and the questions. And of course, I want to thank the audience for joining us. We on the committee get a lot of satisfaction out of putting this program together, but the value of the program is the viewers. So thank you again for joining us. I hope you'll join us again 2 weeks for the lecture on Turkey. And now let's have a great afternoon.